I heard his voice before I saw him. Flat, almost bored. "You missed everything," he said, standing in the doorway like he'd just stopped by for coffee. My hand was still on the envelope, the one I hadn't opened in 3 days because I already knew what was inside. Late notices don't surprise you after a while. They just wait. I looked at him and felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not envy. Something heavier. I said, "And I'm still paying," before I could stop myself. The room went quiet. Not the calm kind. The kind where every sound you've avoided for years finally catches up to you at once. I grew up believing that if you stayed put long enough, life would eventually notice. Our house was small, always smelled faintly of dust and old cooking oil, but it was solid. My father believed in things that didn't move. Work you could point to, routines you could repeat, bills you paid even when they scared you. My brother learned early how to leave a room before it asked anything of him. We were close as kids. Not in the loud way people imagine brothers, but in the quiet agreements. We shared a room, shared excuses, shared the long afternoons after school when nothing happened, and that felt like a gift. He was the one who talked. I was the one who listened. Teachers liked him. Neighbors remembered him. I was the reliable one, the one who came home on time. When our mother got sick, that difference hardened. Someone had to stay. Someone had to learn the names of medications, the sound of her breathing at night, the way fear settles into furniture. I stayed because no one asked me not to. He left because someone told him he could. At first, his leaving felt temporary. A few weeks, then months, then it became something we worked around. He called when he remembered, sent messages that started with crazy busy and ended with promises that didn't need dates. I didn't resent him then. I told myself we were both doing what we were good at. He moved forward. I held things together. I took a job close to home. Then another. Then a third that fit around hospital hours and grocery runs and nights when sleep wasn't an option. Responsibility doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small pieces you don't refuse because each one seems reasonable on its own. By the time I realized I was tired, I couldn't point to the moment it started. Our father aged faster after she died. He didn't say it out loud, but he leaned on me in ways that made leaving feel impossible. The house needed repairs, paperwork stacked up. There were choices that didn't feel like choices. I learned how to keep my voice even when money conversations turned sharp. Learned how to say, "It's fine," and mean, "There's no alternative." My brother's life, from a distance, looked lighter. New places, new people, stories that didn't circle back on themselves. When he visited, he brought energy with him, like he was doing us a favor by reminding the house what movement felt like. People listened when he spoke. I watched from the side, holding plates, collecting coats, making sure things didn't fall apart. I told myself this was loyalty, that staying counted for something, that sacrifice accumulated interest. But loyalty doesn't send receipts, and time doesn't explain itself. Years passed quietly. Birthdays acknowledged late. Conversations shortened. Our paths didn't just separate, they stopped intersecting. By the time I started opening envelopes with shaking hands, the pattern was already set. I was the one who absorbed impact, the one who adjusted, the one who stayed long enough for consequences to find me. And somewhere along the way, without ever saying it out loud, I began to understand that my brother hadn't taken a risk, and won. He had simply left before the cost became visible. The point where things stopped being theoretical came on an afternoon that didn't look important at first. I was at the kitchen table, papers spread out the way they always were, when the phone rang. It wasn't a crisis call. No raised voices. Just a woman from an office I recognized by name but not by face, explaining calmly that a deadline had passed, and there were consequences now. I remember saying, "I understand," even though I didn't yet. I remember writing the amount down twice because the first number didn't feel real. And I remember the moment after the call ended, when the house stayed exactly the same. The clock kept ticking. The refrigerator hummed. Nothing reacted to the fact that I'd just lost the last bit of flexibility I didn't know I was using. That was the day I called my brother and didn't soften my voice. I told him what was happening. Not dramatically, just facts, numbers, timelines. Silence filled the gaps where reassurance should have been. When he finally spoke, he said, "I didn't know it was that bad." Not apologetic, surprised, as if the situation had developed independently of the years he wasn't there. I didn't ask him for money. That's important. I didn't want help. I wanted recognition. I wanted him to hear the weight in it, to understand that staying hadn't been passive, that it had cost something. Instead, he said, "You know, you could have left too." The sentence landed wrong. Not cruel exactly, just clean, simple, like a solution offered after the window had closed. I hung up after that. Not angrily, just done. And in the days that followed, I realized something uncomfortable. The problem wasn't the bill, or the job, or even the years of being the one who stayed. The problem was that, at some point, my role had become invisible. Necessary, but unremarkable. Like plumbing. You only notice it when it fails. When my brother finally came back for a longer visit months later, it was because something in his life had stalled. A pause between chapters. He talked about it like a temporary setback. I listened, nodded, offered him the room that used to be ours. Old habits have muscle memory. He looked around the house and said, "It's exactly the same." I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "That's because I made it that way." That was the moment I understood we hadn't just chosen different paths. We had chosen different definitions of cost. He paid in uncertainty. I paid in permanence. And only one of us had ever been expected to absorb it quietly. After that visit, the balance shifted in ways that were hard to explain, but easy to feel. He stayed for a few weeks, long enough for routines to bend around him. Long enough for old patterns to wake up. He slept late. I adjusted my mornings. He left dishes in the sink. I washed them without thinking. Not because he asked, because the house had trained me. At night, we sat at the same table we'd grown up around. He talked about plans that were forming, opportunities that might open. Everything in his language pointed forward. Mine stayed practical. Repairs, appointments, deadlines. When he paused, expecting something, approval, maybe admiration, I gave him a nod that was meant to be neutral, but probably wasn't. Money hovered between us without ever landing. He never offered help. I never asked. Instead, he'd say things like, "You're strong. You've always been able to handle stuff." It sounded like a compliment. It felt like a verdict. The pressure didn't explode. It pressed, slowly. Bills stacked with the precision of gravity. My work hours stretched, not dramatically, just enough to erase evenings. Friends stopped calling after too many declined invitations. I told myself this was temporary. Everything difficult pretends to be. My brother noticed the fatigue before I did. One night he said, "You look tired," the way people comment on weather. I shrugged. There was no language left to explain exhaustion that had become structural. You don't recover from something that's still happening. When he left again, the house felt smaller, quieter, not lonelier, just tighter. like it was holding its breath. I realized then that his visits weren't support. They were interruptions. They reminded me of a life that moved, while mine absorbed impact. Weeks later, another envelope arrived. Then another. I stopped opening them right away. Not out of denial, out of triage. Some things hurt less if you schedule them. He called during that time, cheerful, distracted. I let it ring longer than usual. When I answered, he said, "I've been thinking. You should sell the house. Start fresh." Start fresh? As if freshness was a switch. As if the years inside those walls hadn't shaped me into someone who stayed because leaving felt like collapse. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said, "That house is the reason you can still talk about starting fresh." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to confirm he'd heard me. Then he changed the subject. That was the escalation. Not the bills, not the fatigue, not even the loneliness. It was the realization that every time I tried to name the cost, he translated it into advice. And advice is what people give when they don't intend to share the weight. The moment itself was smaller than everything that led to it. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a sentence spoken out loud that couldn't be taken back. He came by unannounced. Late afternoon. I was standing at the counter, sorting mail I'd already opened once, when he walked in like the house still belonged to both of us. He picked up an envelope, frowned at it, and said, "You know, if you'd told me earlier, things might have been different." That's when something finally lined up inside me. I took the envelope from his hand, slowly, put it back on the counter. I said, "I did tell you. For years. You just heard it as background noise." He laughed once. Not cruelly. Uncomfortably. "Come on. You make it sound like I did this to you." I looked at him then. Really looked. Same face. Older around the eyes. Still expecting space to be made. I said, "I'm done carrying this alone." He waited. I could see it in his posture. Waiting for the version of me that would soften, explain, retreat. I didn't. "I'm selling the house," I said. "Not to start fresh, to finish something. And whatever happens after that, it's mine, not ours." The silence that followed had weight. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "That house is our history." "No," I said. "It's my responsibility. Those aren't the same thing." He asked where he was supposed to fit into that. It wasn't dramatic, just confused. I answered honestly. "You don't. Not like before." That was the door closing. Not the sale. Not the money. That sentence. He stood there a few seconds longer, then nodded like he'd reached a conclusion that didn't include me. When he left, he didn't look back. I didn't follow him to the door. I stood alone in the kitchen, hands shaking, heart steady for the first time in years. I didn't feel relief. I felt accuracy. Like something had finally been named correctly. The cost didn't disappear, but it stopped being shared in silence. And that changed everything. What remained afterward wasn't peace. It was space. The house emptied faster than I expected. Not emotionally, physically. Rooms lost their purpose once I stopped protecting them. Furniture sold. Papers filed, then shredded. The walls stayed quiet, but it was a different quiet now. Not the kind that waits for you to fix something. The kind that lets you sit down. The sale didn't solve everything. It closed some doors and exposed others. I moved into a smaller place where nothing had history with me. No one had ever been sick there. No one had ever left. At night, I slept without listening for sounds that weren't coming. My brother didn't call for a long time. When he finally did, months later, His voice sounded careful, polite, like we were starting over, but without saying so. He talked about work, about plans. I listened. When the call ended, there was no ache, just distance, clearly measured. People still say things like, "You did the right thing," or "You're so strong." I don't correct them. Strength isn't what it looks like from the outside. Sometimes it's just the moment you stop pretending a burden is shared. I still get envelopes. Fewer now. I open them when they arrive. I pay what I can. I live within what's left. There's no triumph in it. Just ownership. Sometimes I think about that sentence he said, "You missed everything." I understand now what he meant. He missed the wait. I missed the escape. And yes, I'm still paying. But for the first time, I know exactly what I'm paying for.